oil producer, Nigeria, is moving up India's priority list as a key supplier. India's state-owned refiners have significantly increased purchases from Nigeria between September and October. Over 2 million barrels of Nigerian crude are expected to arrive in India. Last week, the Indian Oil Corporation locked in 1 million barrels of Nigeria's Agbami crude for September delivery. Bharat Petroleum Corporation Limited has also been active, making spot purchases and negotiating for additional September shipments. In recent years, India has been diversifying its sources, also bringing crude from Angola, the US, and West Asia.
India has been one of the biggest buyers of discounted Russian crude, defying the Western-led boycott after Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. In the first half of this year, Russia supplied around 35% of India's total oil imports, making it the country's largest supplier. But now India seems to be bringing up imports of its other oil partners. This could be possibly due to US President Donald Trump's increased pressure on New Delhi. Trump announced an extra 25% tariff on top of the existing 25%, doubling duties to 50% on many Indian exports to the US. This was aimed at forcing India to cut Russian oil imports. As of late July, India's state refiners reportedly suspended purchases of Russian crude, and the country is now further diversifying its supply chain. Nigeria is emerging as a natural fit.
For decades, the world believed this moment would never come. Economists insisted Africa would always export cheap raw materials and import expensive finished products. Politicians in Washington, London, Paris, and Brussels built entire economic models assuming Africa would remain the supplier, never the owner. Corporations built infrastructure, contracts, and multi-billion-dollar market positions assuming Africa would keep selling its cobalt, lithium, gold, manganese, titanium, gas, and oil at bargain-level prices while the West controlled the real money, refining, manufacturing, and technology production. But in 2025, something snapped. One government after another across the African continent began passing laws that stunned global markets. Overnight, Africa started shutting down the old system. No more raw exports. No more Western-controlled processing chains. No more resource partner deals designed in Europe. African leaders declared a new era. Africa would finally take full ownership of the minerals, metals, and energy resources that fuel the modern world's most expensive industries. And the Western economies built on these resources were not ready. Electric vehicles, smartphones, renewable energy, aerospace, medical technology, military manufacturing. Every one of these industries depends on materials sourced from Africa. Cobalt from the Congo, lithium from Zimbabwe, manganese from South Africa, titanium from Kenya, rare earths from Burundi, gold from Ghana, oil from Nigeria and Angola, gas from Mozambique and Tanzania. For the first time in modern history, Africa is not only supplying the world. Africa is processing, refining, manufacturing, and controlling pricing. And the value of the industries being taken back? Over $5 trillion. Today, the West is scrambling. Car companies are panicking. Tech companies are rewriting plans. Energy giants are begging for new contracts. European governments are meeting in emergency sessions. And the United States is watching a global power shift unfold that no one thought possible. This is the story of how Africa took back a $5 trillion industry, and why the West is furious. Africa supplies around 40 to 60% of the minerals that power the global economy. But for more than half a century, the continent earned only a small fraction of the actual value because nearly all processing, refining, and technology manufacturing were done overseas. Western companies extracted raw materials, shipped them abroad, refined them into high-value components, then sold those components back to the world, including Africa, at massive markups. For example, raw cobalt from the DRC sells for roughly $30,000 per ton. After refining in Europe or China, that same ton becomes $90,000 in battery-grade form. Once used inside EV battery packs, the value jumps to over $200,000. Inside finished electric vehicles, the value skyrockets even higher. And this model existed across industries. Africa exported raw gold, not gold bars. Raw oil, not refined petrol. Raw lithium, not battery cells. Raw cocoa, not chocolate. Raw gas, not LNG. Raw bauxite, not aluminum. Raw manganese, not steel components. Western corporations outsourced the lowest value stage to Africa and kept the wealth-building stages for themselves. But this system required one thing. Africa had to stay dependent. That dependency is now gone. The shift began with a handful of bold decisions. Zimbabwe banned raw lithium exports and forced companies to build processing plants inside the country. Namibia banned the export of raw critical minerals and demanded domestic refining. Ghana and Nigeria introduced policies requiring refinery construction before new oil contracts. DRC announced a multi-billion-dollar plan to build Africa's largest battery manufacturing zone. Botswana renegotiated diamond agreements that gave the country more control and higher revenue. Tanzania enforced beneficiation laws that forced foreign mining companies to process minerals locally. Zambia pushed for joint copper processing partnerships instead of exporting raw ore. These weren't isolated moves. This was a coordinated continental shift. Then came the shockwave. The African Union announced a Pan-African mineral processing framework, encouraging nations to block raw exports, demand domestic value addition, create regional refining hubs, build unified pricing systems, form sovereign mineral reserves, prioritize African manufacturers. Negotiate as a bloc instead of individually. This meant raw materials that the West depended on would now be processed where they were found, in Africa. And the West did not see it coming. Western economies rely heavily on African resources for the core of their industrial strength. When Africa shut down raw exports, the shock was immediate. Automotive industry collapse warning. European car companies issued urgent internal memos as the price of African EV minerals surged. Without cheap African cobalt and manganese, Europe cannot meet its EV transition goals. Tech companies in panic mode. Apple, Samsung, and electric tech manufacturers quietly began shifting supply chains because refined African minerals became more expensive and less predictable to access. Oil and gas disruptions. Nigeria's insistence on local refining shook global petroleum prices. Western energy companies realized they could no longer depend on cheap crude from Africa. Defense industry fears the United States relies on African titanium, rare earths, and manganese for aircraft, naval technology, and precision military systems. Analysts warned of future shortages. EU economic worries. Europe's dependence on African resources is significantly larger than publicly discussed. The EU imports 68% of cobalt, 79% of manganese, 47% of platinum, 32% of phosphates, 29% of rare earths, and now Africa is controlling them. What Africa is forming isn't just policy. It's a blueprint for becoming a global manufacturing and technology powerhouse. The plan includes building 35 new mineral processing zones across the continent, launching Africa's first battery manufacturing corridors, negotiating pricing as a united bloc, creating regional energy grids to power factories, partnering with Asia and the Middle East instead of the West, establishing Africa-owned shipping lines, creating Pan-African sovereign resource funds. Analysts estimate the total economic value at over $5 trillion during the next decade. Africa is no longer just exporting the ingredients. Africa is becoming the factory. Once Africa tightened control, prices of lithium and cobalt spiked, Western manufacturing timelines collapsed, battery factories in Europe paused their expansions, the US issued strategic mineral emergency warnings, Japan and South Korea began rushing to sign African deals, China doubled its investments to avoid losing influence. Africa has become the battlefield for global supply chains. Several key factors make this shift sustainable. Africa is forming regional blocs instead of acting individually. China, India, UAE, and Saudi Arabia support African industrialization. Africa has the youngest workforce in the world. Infrastructure investment is at the highest level in modern history. Digital technology adoption is accelerating. Sovereign wealth funds are protecting revenue. More African governments are rejecting exploitative deals. For the first time ever, Africa holds the leverage. The world's most valuable industries now depend on Africa's decisions. Processing, manufacturing, and industrial development are finally happening on African soil. And the West is facing the reality of a global system shifting away from old power centers. Africa didn't just take back its resources. Africa took back the future.